Welcome back. Welcome back. As Israel celebrates its 60th birthday, of course, this week, US President George Bush is in the region and he's hoping that his visit will add momentum to the peace process. That, as we discussed last week, he wants completed before he leaves office at the end of the year. In many ways, the situation now is a mirror image of 8 years ago, when President Clinton was also seeking an Israeli-Palestinian peace solution before leaving office. His Middle East envoy and chief negotiator was Dennis Ross. So he knows a hell of a lot about this process and how it can be done. So I put to him that it's a case of déjà vu all over again.
Well, it is in some respects, but it's different in another. One important difference is that the U.S. role in this particular process is much less a mediator and more a kind of convener, more a kind of, I would say, episodic role is being played by this administration. You don't see the secretary or the president actually doing much negotiating, whereas during the Clinton administration, you had an envoy in myself. You had the secretary and the president actually playing very active brokering roles. The Bush administration is far more active than it was previously, but it still has a little bit of what I would describe as a hands-off approach. It still is reluctant to actually try to broker understandings, and it certainly isn't putting its own ideas forward, at least at this stage.
At the same time, there has been a lot of activity from the Secretary of State, number of trips to the Middle East and so on. Condi Rice has been active, hasn't she?
She certainly has, and she is certainly talking to the side. She's making trips on a regular basis. And the critical question is, what's the nature of her objective? How does she define her role in this? If she decides that the parties themselves find it difficult to reach an agreement, is she prepared to offer bridging ideas of her own? Is she waiting to be asked by the parties, or is she prepared to volunteer something on her own? In a sense, there is a higher degree of involvement, but there still is a certain hesitancy to actually be a broker or a mediator.
And would you say that the situation in the years since that last year of the Clinton administration, that the problem has seen some steps forward? I mean, obviously, the recognition by the US of a two-state solution, that's a step forward towards possible settlement. At the same time, the coming of Hamas in a much more powerful role, including that of controlling Gaza, what the role of Hamas will be, because there's got to have a role somewhere, that is a fact that's more difficult, isn't it? So is the situation today, this awkward, difficult situation, more difficult today, or has it improved a bit since your day with Bill Clinton?
Well, I would say, I think there's two elements where you could say there's an improvement, and then there's a larger context where you'd say, in fact, there's a setback. The two elements are that you actually have two leaders, in the case of Mahmoud Abbas and Ehud Olmert, who believe in each other. And I think that's really the first time since Oslo that we can say that an Israeli leader and a Palestinian leader actually believe in each other, believe in the intentions of the other, and actually believe that maybe together they can reach an agreement. A second element is that you actually have a formal posture on the part of the United States of recognizing a two-state solution. When we put the Clinton ideas on the table in the year 2000, the end of the year 2000, what was embodied in those ideas was a two-state solution, but it wasn't formal American policy. It was they represented ideas that we presented to be a bridge between the two sides, simply that, not as a statement of American policy. That's what I would call the good news. The bad news is that Hamas rules Gaza. Hamas rejects the very idea of a two-state solution and embodies a different narrative for how to approach the conflict itself. And I also think you have something else that's worse. The publics on each side are completely disbelieving. Go back to the year 2000, and actually the publics had high expectations and believed an agreement was going to take place. Look at the publics today, and you find very large majorities on each side, Israeli and Palestinian alike, who don't believe that peace is even possible. Now, that's very negative, I think, because it creates a context where it's hard to empower the leaders to take historic leaps, to take on history and mythology, even if their intentions are quite good and even if they believe in each other. They realize that if they take this leap, they're not sure how their publics are going to respond.
And if you were in this situation now and looking at the various key issues, the settlements, the refugees, right to return, Jerusalem, Gaza, borders, etc., which to you would be the most urgent and the one that has to be solved first?
I would focus very heavily on what I describe as the public context to create the foundation, and there are two elements to that. Element number one is I do think you're going to have to find a way to produce a ceasefire in Gaza lest it explode and basically destroy your prospect of having any political outcome or any political process. And the other would be there's more has to be done to address this kind of cynicism and disbelief on the part of both publics. I'm not saying that you can get the two publics to believe again, but you've got to do enough on the ground for each side to give them a reason to take a second look.
And you think that the Middle Eastern public today is more dubious about America today and George Bush than it was about America in the year 2000 with Bill Clinton, do you?
Without a doubt. I mean, there's no question. If you look at America's standing in the Middle East in the year 2000, look at the perception of Bill Clinton. In the year 2000, Bill Clinton could have gone to any place in the Middle East and actually been received by a crowd enthusiastically. Obviously, President Bush can go to the Middle East, but where he goes is always very carefully choreographed to ensure that, in fact, he's not going to be exposed to big public crowds throughout much of the area where I think the reaction could be extraordinarily negative.
How long will it be before there's a Palestinian state?
I think if you ask me how long will it be before we actually have a Palestinian state in being as opposed to in theory, I think we're years away from a Palestinian state in being. In theory, we could at least have a Palestinian state recognized in principle by all sides by the end of the year, even if it's not something that can be implemented anytime soon.
Ambassador Ross, thank you very much for joining us. Thank you so much.
It was my pleasure. Thank you.
After a relatively quiet few weeks since the election, there's fresh turmoil in Pakistan with the resignation from the coalition government of the 9 ministers of Nawaz Sharif's Pakistan Muslim League N party. Mr. Sharif is demanding the reinstatement of more than 60 judges sacked by President Musharraf last November. The president feared that they would rule his election or his emergency rule unlawful and move to impeach him. Asif Zardari, the widower of Benazir Bhutto and the co-chairman of the biggest coalition party, the Pakistan People's Party, may himself face corruption charges if the judges return with all their powers intact. So, what next? With me is Farzana Shaikh from the Royal Institute of International Affairs. Welcome back, Farzana. Now, and in fact, they've said they'll still support the government, haven't they? We mustn't exaggerate. The 9 who are resigning are going to still vote with the government.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
in fact, the arrangement is that they have withdrawn from the cabinet, but they remain part of the coalition. That is strictly.
So it's not crumbling to that extent.
No,
now,
it's under strain.
Yes, that's a perfect phrase. Now, what is the crux of this? It is, in fact, to do with the judges, 60-plus judges, and the Chief Justice in particular.
Yeah.
And they were, in fact, going to restore the judges by the end of April, and they didn't do it. Why didn't it happen?
Well, essentially, the disagreement centers on the question of whether or not these judges should be unconditionally reinstated, which is Sharif's position, or whether they should be reinstated as part of a broader constitutional package, which is Zardari's position. Now, what is at issue here is Sharif's claim that if the judges were to be reinstated as part of a constitutional package, there might be an attempt by those siding with the president to curb the judges' powers. So essentially what Sharif and his party are pressing for is the unconditional reinstatement in the first place of the judges who were sacked by Musharraf, and of course, by extension, remove those judges that he apparently illegally installed in their place. Sharif has agreed that the current judges may be retained on some sort of ad hoc basis, but they cannot be expected to continue in post once all 60 judges of the original courts have been reinstated.
So at the moment, though, the passion, on the one hand, Zardari, for his reasons, doesn't want to go all the way with Nawaz Sharif on this point. On the other hand, he does, Nawaz Sharif, partially for purely personal reasons of revenge, vengeance, because he was twice deported by President Sharif, right? So it's very, very bitter there.
That's right. He was forced to return back to Saudi Arabia, and of course, Musharraf is the man who also ousted Sharif in 1999. But I think what is important to stress here is that all three main players, Musharraf, Zardari, and Sharif, have very high personal stakes in this matter. Musharraf himself, of course, is keen to ensure his own political and personal survival, which he believes might be threatened with the reinstatement of the judges, particularly the former Chief Justice, Chaudhry Iftikhar. Sharif, as you've just said, has his own personal interest in this matter, and that is, of course, to oust President Musharraf without any further delay. He feels that's absolutely essential. And Zardari, for his part, is concerned to secure his own political future by making sure that corruption allegations against him are not reopened in court.
Now, interestingly in all of that, what does President Musharraf do every day now? Does he go into the office at 9 and nobody telephones him, or what? I mean, he's not running the country, he's not running the government, is he? I mean, is he doing anything?
Well, there are conflicting reports. There are, of course, those who say that President Musharraf nowadays is a man with a lot of time on his hands. He spends most of his time playing bridge. There are others, of course, particularly within Sharif's party, who would have us believe that, in fact, the president is a very busy man these days. He's very busy conspiring to destabilize the coalition government, conspiring to make sure that this alliance between Zardari and Sharif remains as fragile as possible, because that is the only way in which his own, that is to say, Musharraf's position can be secured and strengthened.
So what, in conclusion, what's your prediction about what will happen here? Will the strain go away, the strain on the coalition go away? Will we see a clear solution?
Well, I think it's very, very difficult to predict anything with any degree of certainty at the moment. I think what can be said, as you yourself have just pointed out, is that this is a coalition under strain. I think one should also emphasize that few people really expected this coalition to have a smooth ride. The People's Party and Sharif's party have been at daggers drawn for many years, and the fact that they even agreed to form a coalition government took many by surprise. As far as President Musharraf is concerned, I think what one can say is that while he may have gained some time, it's not at all certain that he has gained in strength. And I think what he might be looking for in this instance is to eventually step down, but do so at a moment of his own choosing.
Thank you very much indeed, Farzana. Well, there we see the turmoil probably going to continue. We'll keep our tabs on it, and no doubt so will you as well. After the news, part 2 of that fascinating conversation we had with Michael Caine. Don't miss it, don't miss him.